May 1943. The freezing mist of the North Atlantic begins to thin. On the rusted deck of a Liberty ship entering New York Harbor, thousands of men in tattered field gray uniforms press against the railing. They are soldiers of the Wehrmacht, captured in the burning sands of Tunisia, now transporting across the ocean to an enemy land they have only known through the screaming voice of Joseph Goebbels. They expect ruins. For years, they have been told that the Luftwaffe has leveled American cities, that New York is a smoking graveyard of steel and glass, crippled by German air power. They grip the cold steel of the ship, waiting to see the proof of their impending victory. But as the sun burns through the fog, a collective gasp sweeps through the ranks. Rising from the water is not a ruin, but a titan. The Manhattan skyline stands completely intact, glistening in the morning light. The Statue of Liberty holds her torch high, untouched by war. Ferries cut through the water, cars move freely along the shoreline. There is no blackout, there is no rubble. In that single, terrifying moment, the lie disintegrates, and the prisoners realize they have been brought to a land that the war has not even scratched. To understand the shattering psychological impact of that first sight of the American coast, one must first understand the mental fortress in which the German soldier lived. Since 1933, and intensifying sharply after 1939, the Wehrmacht had not just been fighting a physical war. They had been isolated within a carefully constructed reality engineered by Joseph Goebbels and the Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. The average lancer, the common foot soldier, did not simply believe that Germany was winning. He believed that Germany was invincible and that her enemies were crumbling under the weight of their own degeneracy. The narrative regarding the United States was particularly vicious and specific. German newspapers and radio broadcasts painted a picture of America as a hollow giant. It was depicted as a culturally bankrupt nation, run by Jewish plutocrats and gangsters, inhabited by a racially mixed population that lacked the discipline and warrior spirit of the Aryan race. Propaganda films showed footage of strikes, poverty from the Great Depression, and civil unrest, framing the U.S. as a country on the brink of internal collapse. More importantly, as the war turned global, the German High Command needed to neutralize the fear of American industrial power. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, the German soldier was assured that the Atlantic Ocean was a German lake. The U-boat Wolf Packs were presented not just as a blockade force, but as a stranglehold that had completely cut off North America from the rest of the world. By 1943, the lies became more desperate and more audacious. As British and American bombers began to turn German cities into rubble, the Nazi propaganda machine retaliated with fiction. Soldiers on the front lines were told that the Luftwaffe was exacting a terrible revenge. They were fed reports that New York City, Washington, D.C., and Boston were being subjected to the same aerial bombardment as Hamburg and Cologne. Many German troops genuinely believed that the skyscrapers of Manhattan were jagged stumps and that the American population was cowering in cellars, starving, and demoralized. This worldview held firm even as the military situation on the ground began to deteriorate. The first major influx of German prisoners did not come from the beaches of Normandy, but from the scorching sands of North Africa. In May 1943, the German Afrika Korps, once the pride of the Wehrmacht under Erwin Rommel, collapsed in Tunisia. Over 230,000 Axis soldiers surrendered in a matter of days, a defeat comparable in scale to Stalingrad, though less spoken of in Berlin. Yet even in defeat, the arrogance remained. These men did not see themselves as beaten. They viewed their surrender as a logistical failure, a result of running out of fuel and ammunition rather than a lack of fighting prowess. They marched into captivity with their heads high, singing marching songs, convinced that the final victory was still inevitable. They believed their captivity would be short. They believed the Wehrmacht would soon cross the Atlantic to liberate them. But the reality of their situation was about to shift drastically. The Allies found themselves with a logistical nightmare, hundreds of thousands of prisoners in the North African desert with nowhere to house them and limited food and water. Britain was already overcrowded and rationing food. It could not absorb an army of hungry mouths. The decision was made to transport them to the only place with the space and resources to handle them, the continental United States. For the German soldier, this news was met with a mixture of trepidation and curiosity. They were about to enter the lion's den, the heart of the enemy territory they had heard so much about but never seen. They boarded the transport trucks and marched toward the ports of Casablanca and Oran, carrying their kit bags and their propaganda-fueled illusions. They were leaving the war zone, but they were carrying the war with them in their minds. They were convinced they were traveling to a land of devastation, a broken country that was barely holding on. They had no concept that they were leaving a starving continent for a land of surplus. The stage was set for a collision between ideology and reality. As the ramps of the transport ships lowered and the men were herded into the holds, they were still soldiers of the Reich, mentally armored against the degenerate West. They did not know that the most dangerous weapon the Americans possessed was not a rifle or a tank, but a loaf of white bread and a train ticket across the Midwest. The journey had begun, and the first casualty would be their worldview. The vessels waiting in the harbors of North Africa were not luxury liners. They were liberty ships, ugly, utilitarian giants welded together in American shipyards at a speed the German engineers found impossible to believe. To the captured soldiers, these ships were the first tangible evidence of the industrial capacity they had been fighting. There were no rivets, only endless seams of welding. They were mass-produced cargo carriers, designed to haul tanks and wheat, now repurposed to haul the living wreckage of the Afrika Korps. Thousands of men were herded into the deep holds of these ships. The accommodations were primitive. Tiers of canvas bunks were stacked 5 or 6 high, creating a dense forest of humanity in the dimly lit belly of the vessel. The air grew heavy almost immediately, thick with the smell of diesel oil, stale sweat, and seasickness. Ventilation was poor. For men used to the open desert, the claustrophobia was suffocating. As the ships cast off and joined the massive convoys heading west, a strange and terrifying irony settled over the prisoners. For years, they had cheered the news of U-boat victories. They had celebrated the tonnage sunk by the grey wolves of the Atlantic. Now, locked below the waterline of an Allied transport, they found themselves the targets of their own navy. They knew better than anyone what a torpedo could do to a hull like this. Every metallic groan of the ship, every sudden change in engine RPM, sent a jolt of adrenaline through the holds. They were trapped in a steel coffin, praying that their comrades in the submarines would miss. The crossing took weeks. To maintain discipline and morale in the stifling darkness, the German non-commissioned officers enforced a strict routine. They organized lectures on National Socialist ideology. They sang marching songs that reverberated off the steel bulkheads, the sound drifting up to the bewildered American guards on deck. They maintained their hierarchy, punishing defeatism and keeping the dream of the Reich alive. Even in chains, they remained a functioning army. On deck, the scene was one of staggering magnitude. When the prisoners were allowed up for fresh air, they saw the ocean filled with ships. The convoy stretched to the horizon, tankers, freighters, troop transports, all ringed by American and British destroyers that circled the flock like sheepdogs. The sheer number of vessels was a direct contradiction to the propaganda reports that claimed the Allied merchant marine had been decimated. If the Americans were running out of ships, where did all of this steel come from? As the days turned into weeks, the convoy moved out of the danger zone of the mid-Atlantic and approached the eastern seaboard of the United States. The tension in the holds began to shift from fear of death to an anxious curiosity. The prisoners scrubbed their uniforms as best they could. They shaved with cold water. They wanted to look like soldiers of the Wehrmacht when they arrived, to show the Americans that they were unbroken. They prepared themselves for the ruins. They expected to see a coastline battered by war, harbors choked with debris, and a people exhausted by conflict. They had no concept that they were approaching a nation that was currently producing more than half of the world's manufacturing output. They were about to collide with the greatest economic engine in human history, operating at full capacity. The engines slowed. The rolling motion of the open ocean settled into the calm drift of a harbor approach. The heavy steel doors of the holds were thrown open, and the order was given to come on deck. The light poured in, blinding men who had spent weeks in the gloom. They climbed the ladders, adjusting their caps, straightening their tunics, ready to sneer at the poverty of their captors. The gangways were lowered, connecting the rusted hull of the Liberty ship to the solid concrete of the pier. As the first boots of the Afrika Korps touched American soil, the men braced themselves for the devastation they had been promised. They looked for the craters. They scanned the horizon for the jagged silhouettes of bombed-out buildings. They listened for the wail of air raid sirens. Instead, they were met with a wall of noise and motion that seemed to belong to a different planet. The docks at Hampton Roads, Boston, and New York were not graveyards. They were hives of frantic mechanical activity. Cranes swung overhead, lifting crates of supplies by the ton. Forklifts zipped back and forth. The air didn't smell of cordite and wet ash. It smelled of gasoline, coal smoke, and the sea. But the true shock came when they were loaded onto the waiting transport buses and driven through the streets adjacent to the harbors. In Germany, the civilian automobile had effectively gone extinct. Private vehicles had long since been commandeered by the Wehrmacht or abandoned for lack of fuel. The streets of Berlin and Hamburg were dominated by military traffic, bicycles, and pedestrians picking their way through rubble. Here the roads were choked with cars, not just military trucks, but civilian automobiles, sedans, coupes, delivery vans, moving in endless streams. To the German soldier, whose army still relied heavily on horses for logistics, the sheer density of motorized transport was incomprehensible. They pressed their faces against the glass of the buses, staring at the traffic jams. One prisoner later recalled thinking that the Americans must have staged a parade to impress them, gathering every car in the city to drive in circles. It was impossible to accept that this was merely a Tuesday afternoon. Then there were the people. The crowds watching the prisoners pass were not the gaunt, shell-shocked survivors of a war-torn nation. They looked healthy. Men wore tailored suits and fedoras. Women wore colorful dresses and nylon stockings, a luxury item that had vanished from Europe years ago. They didn't look at the sky in fear of bombers. They went about their business with a casual confidence that infuriated the die-hard Nazis among the prisoners. The cognitive dissonance was painful. Propaganda had told them that Jewish bankers and corrupt politicians had driven the American working class into poverty and starvation. Yet here were dockworkers smoking cigarettes and drinking coffee, looking well-fed and strong. The architecture stood tall and arrogant. The Empire State Building, which they had been told was a smoldering ruin, pierced the clouds, a monument to steel and engineering that the Luftwaffe had clearly never touched. Some prisoners refused to believe their eyes. They muttered to one another that this was a trick, a Potemkin village built of cardboard and plywood solely to demoralize them. They argued that the bus route had been carefully selected to hide the destruction just a few blocks away. But as the buses moved deeper into the city, past mile after mile of intact brick and mortar, the silence in the vehicles grew heavier. The grandeur of the American coast was not a stage set. It was a fortress of industry, and it was completely, terrifyingly untouched. From the coastal processing centers, the prisoners were ordered onto trains for the final leg of their journey to the permanent internment camps scattered across the American interior, places like Texas, Oklahoma, Mississippi, and Colorado. In the German military tradition, troop transport meant 40 and 8 boxcars, wooden wagons designed to hold 40 men or 8 horses, freezing in winter and stifling in summer, with nothing but straw for bedding. But when the prisoners were marched onto the platforms at Penn Station or Union Station, they stopped in their tracks. Waiting for them were not cattle cars, but passenger coaches. They were older models, certainly, pulled from the back of the rolling stock to serve prisoners, but to the eyes of a lancer who had spent months sleeping in foxholes, they were palaces. There were upholstered seats covered in velvet or sturdy fabric. There were glass windows that opened and closed. There were heating systems. Some reports even mentioned prisoners hesitating to sit down, fearing they would dirty the upholstery with their dusty field uniforms. As the trains lurched forward and the cities faded behind them, a new and deeper shock set in, one that was less about luxury and more about geography. In Europe, a soldier could cross a national border in a few hours of driving. Wars were fought over strips of land 20 miles deep. The scale of the conflict was dense and claustrophobic. But the American trains traveled for hours, then days, without ever reaching a border. They rolled past the endless industrial belts of Pennsylvania and Ohio, seeing factory after factory glowing in the night. And this was the second revelation. There was no blackout. In Europe, a single lit cigarette could invite a sniper's bullet or a bomber's payload. Here, entire cities blazed with light. Farmhouses stood illuminated in the middle of nowhere, defiant and safe. The psychological weight of seeing a continent completely unafraid of aerial attack was crushing. As they crossed the Mississippi and entered the Great Plains, the sheer emptiness of the land began to terrify the officers. They stared out at the horizon where the corn and wheat fields stretched to infinity, mile after mile of rich black soil, no craters, no trenches, just food, endless, staggering amounts of food. For the tactical minds among the officers, this journey was the moment the war truly ended. They pulled out maps, tracing the route. They realized that even if the Wehrmacht had somehow miraculously crossed the Atlantic and seized New York, they would still be facing a logistical impossibility. The United States was not a country, it was a continent disguised as a nation. It had strategic depth that was incomprehensible to a European mind. One German officer, watching the Texas landscape roll by after 2 days of travel, reportedly slumped in his seat and whispered to a guard, "We never could have beaten this. The space alone would have swallowed us." By the time the trains slowed to a halt at the remote sidings of the internment camps, the men were no longer just prisoners of war. They were witnesses to a geopolitical reality that Goebbels had desperately tried to hide. Germany was fighting a war against a giant that hadn't even begun to sweat. The trains finally hissed to a halt. The sliding doors opened, revealing the landscape of the American interior, often dry, dusty plains in Texas or the lush green farmland of the Midwest. The prisoners were marched out, surrounded by armed MPs and the familiar sight of barbed wire and watchtowers. For a moment, the comfort of the train ride evaporated, replaced by the grim reality of incarceration. They were marched through the gates of camps like Camp Hien, Camp Concordia, or Camp Aliceville. They expected the treatment to be harsh. They had been told that American prisoners in German hands were treated correctly, but that the Americans, lacking honor and discipline, would likely starve or beat their captives. As they were processed, stripped of their remaining equipment, and assigned barracks, a deep anxiety settled over the ranks. But then came the order that would shatter their resolve more effectively than any artillery barrage: mess hall duty. The prisoners were marched into large wooden buildings. The first thing that hit them was the smell. In the German army, the field kitchens smelled of cabbage, turnips, and the faint, metallic tang of horsemeat stews. Here, the air was thick with the aroma of roasting meat, frying grease, and something almost forgotten in Europe: real coffee. They lined up with metal trays, eyeing the American cooks suspiciously. Then, the serving began. Ladles of beef stew, thick with potatoes and carrots, massive scoops of scrambled eggs, sausages, butter, actual blocks of yellow butter, not the watered-down margarine or animal fat spread used in the Wehrmacht. And then the bread. In Germany, bread was dark, heavy, and rationed. Kommissbrot was fuel, not enjoyment. Here they were handed thick slices of soft, pure white bread. The prisoners froze. They stared at the trays in their hands. For the average German soldier, a meal of this quality was something reserved for a wedding or a high-ranking officer's banquet. To receive it in a prison camp was incomprehensible. A murmur of panic rippled through the line. "Das Henkersmahlzeit," men whispered, "the hangman's meal." It was a logical conclusion for a mind conditioned by total war. Why would the enemy waste such precious resources on prisoners? Surely, this was the final meal before they were taken out back and machine-gunned. Some men refused to eat, their hands shaking, convinced that the food was poisoned or that the execution squads were waiting outside. But the American guards just watched, bored and indifferent. They weren't mocking the prisoners, they were simply waiting for them to finish so they could clear the hall. The Americans were eating the same food. There was no malice, only calories. Slowly the hunger took over. They took the first bites. The taste of real sugar, fresh milk, and meat that wasn't mostly gristle sent a shockwave through their systems. They ate voraciously, wiping the trays clean with the white bread. And then, the final blow, the cooks offered seconds. In that cafeteria, amidst the clatter of silverware and the smell of roast beef, the fortress of lies collapsed. You cannot tell a man that his enemy is starving when that enemy is feeding his prisoners better than the Reich feeds its own citizens. You cannot maintain the myth of a blockaded, collapsing America when there is so much surplus that they give butter to the enemy. The silence in the barracks that night was different. It wasn't the silence of discipline, it was the silence of realization. One prisoner, writing in his diary years later, summed up the collective feeling of that first dinner. "I looked at the meat on my plate, and I knew we were lost. Not just militarily, but completely. We had been lied to about everything." But while the stomach was easily convinced by white bread and roast beef, the mind was a harder fortress to breach. Inside the barbed wire of the internment camps, a second, silent war began, a civil war between the undeniable reality of American power and the fanatical indoctrination of the Third Reich. The camps were not merely holding pens, they had become little Germanys. The Geneva Convention allowed non-commissioned officers to maintain discipline, and in many camps, hardcore Nazi loyalists, often from the SS or the specialized Afrika Korps units, seized control of the internal hierarchy. They established a reign of terror behind the backs of the American guards. They organized morning roll calls with the Hitler salute. They stitched swastika flags out of colored scraps of fabric and hung them in the barracks. They forbade any talk of defeat. To these hardliners, the abundance of food and the sight of untouched cities were not proof of American superiority, but evidence of a Jewish trick. They argued that the Americans were starving their own people to feed the prisoners, a desperate psychological operation to break the German will. They spread rumors that New York had actually been destroyed, and that the skyline the prisoners saw was a massive Hollywood set constructed to deceive them. It sounds absurd today, but to men whose entire worldview was built on the infallibility of the Führer, believing the lie was safer than accepting the catastrophic truth. Atmosphere in the barracks grew poisonous. Prisoners who expressed doubt, or those who were caught reading American newspapers with too much interest, were labeled traitors. Honor courts or femimord kangaroo courts were convened in the dead of night. In camps like Camp Concordia in Kansas and Camp Tonkawa in Oklahoma, prisoners were beaten, forced to commit suicide, or hanged by their own comrades for the crime of defeatism. The message was clear. The Wehrmacht is watching you, even in Texas. But the Americans possessed a weapon that the camp Gestapo could not suppress: information. Unlike the Soviet Union, which isolated its prisoners, the United States allowed German POWs access to the New York Times, Life magazine, and radio broadcasts. Initially, the prisoners dismissed these as enemy propaganda, but the sheer volume and specificity of the information began to erode their denial. The American newspapers didn't just claim victories, they printed maps, tonnage charts, and casualty lists. They admitted their own losses. They showed photographs of German cities that the prisoners knew: Cologne, Hamburg, Berlin, reduced to hollow shells. The turning point for many came not from a lecture, but from the sky. Many camps were located near U.S. Army Air Force training bases. Day after day, the prisoners looked up to see formations of B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 liberators darkening the sky, thousands of them, gleaming in the sun, practicing for the destruction of the Reich. The math became impossible to ignore. The prisoners saw the endless train cars of tanks moving east. They ate the surplus food. They saw the thousands of bombers. And then, they looked at the fanatical NCOs in the barracks screaming about wonder weapons and final victory, and the spell finally broke. The cognitive dissonance snapped. By 1944, a quiet resignation swept through the majority of the camps. The hardliners remained dangerous, but their influence waned. The average soldier stopped preparing for the Wehrmacht to liberate him and started learning English. They began to hoard their wages, 80 cents a day in canteen scrip, to buy gifts for families they hoped were still alive. The ideological war was over. The belief in the master race had been dismantled, not by a bullet, but by a pork chop, a newspaper, and the undeniable, overwhelming sight of a nation that had mobilized the entire world against them. As the war in Europe ground toward its bloody conclusion, life for the 370,000 German POWs in America settled into a surreal rhythm. They were trapped in what they came to call the Golden Cage, a prison where the walls were made of abundance and safety, but the door remained locked. With millions of American men fighting overseas, the United States faced a critical labor shortage, particularly in agriculture. The solution was sitting in the barracks. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners could be made to work, provided the labor was not dangerous or directly related to the war effort. So the supermen of the Third Reich were put to work harvesting the crops of the democracy they had despised. Every morning, trucks loaded with German soldiers rolled out of the camps and into the American heartland. They picked cotton in Texas, harvested sugar beets in Nebraska, and canned tomatoes in Indiana. And it was here, in the dusty rows of corn and wheat, that the final barriers between enemy and captor began to dissolve. American farmers, initially terrified of having Nazi monsters on their land, found themselves working alongside young men who looked and acted just like their own sons who were fighting in France. The propaganda images of snarling, robotic killers faded away. These were just boys, Hans, Fritz, Dieter, who missed their mothers, worked hard, and loved a cigarette break. The strict non-fraternization rules imposed by the U.S. Army were impossible to enforce in the intimacy of a harvest. Farmers' wives, ignoring the regulations, would often bring the prisoners lemonade or extra sandwiches at lunch. In moments of shared exhaustion under the hot sun, photos were exchanged. A German soldier would show a picture of his wife in Dresden. The American farmer would show a picture of his son in the Pacific. For a brief window of time, the war ceased to exist. But this safety came with a heavy psychological price. As the prisoners worked in the peaceful American sunshine, the news from home grew apocalyptic. They read about the firebombing of Dresden, the encirclement of Berlin, and the total collapse of the German front. They were safe, well-fed, and healthy, but they were watching their nation die from a distance of 4,000 miles. This was the torture of the golden cage. They knew that their survival was a stroke of incredible luck, yet they felt a profound guilt. They were eating white bread and playing soccer on the weekends while their families were being buried under rubble. They were building a harvest for the enemy while their own people starved. By May 1945, when the news of Germany's unconditional surrender reached the camps, there was no cheering. There was no riot. There was only a heavy, suffocating silence. The flags in the little Germanys came down. The Nazi salute stopped. The war was over. They had survived. But the Germany they had left, the arrogant, invincible empire of 1941 or 1942, was gone. In its place was a graveyard they would soon have to visit. The war was over, but the journey home would not be swift. The United States, still needing labor and navigating the logistical chaos of a shattered world, did not repatriate the German prisoners immediately. It wasn't until 1946 that the final large shipments of men began to leave the camps. They packed their few belongings, often hoarding bars of American soap, packs of cigarettes, and nylon stockings for their wives, and boarded the ships in reverse. Leaving America was a strange, melancholic experience. They were leaving the land of the enemy, yet it was a land that had fed them, sheltered them, and treated them with a humanity they had not expected. They looked back at the receding skyline of New York or the bustling docks of Boston one last time. They knew what they were leaving behind: electricity, heat, paved roads, intact houses. They did not yet fully grasp what they were going back to. The Atlantic crossing was summer. When the ships finally docked in Europe, often in Le Havre, Rotterdam, or Bremerhaven, the reverse culture shock hit them with the force of a physical blow. They stepped off the ships into a landscape from hell. The cities they had defended in their minds were gone. Cologne was a skeleton of jagged walls. Hamburg was a wasteland of brick dust. Berlin was a moonscape of craters. The infrastructure was obliterated. There were no trains with velvet seats here. There were only cattle cars, if anything moved at all. There was no white bread. There was a starvation ration of watery potato soup. For the returning POWs, the contrast was agonizing. They had spent the last 2 or 3 years living in the healthiest, wealthiest nation on earth. They were tanned, well-fed, and physically fit. They walked through the streets of their hometowns like giants among a population of ghosts. Their families were gaunt, gray-skinned, and living in cellars. The soap and cigarettes they brought back made them temporary kings in the black market, but the guilt returned, heavier than ever. But amidst the ruins, something else had traveled back with them: a seed. The United States had attempted a formal re-education program in the camps, lectures on democracy and history, But the real re-education hadn't happened in a classroom. It had happened in the mess halls, the cornfields, and the train stations. These 370 men had seen with their own eyes that a democratic society could produce not just freedom, but overwhelming prosperity and power. They had seen that the degenerate system Goebbels mocked was actually capable of feeding the world while fighting a two-front war. They had lived in the future, and now they had returned to the Stone Age. This realization shaped the future of Germany. These returning men did not become insurgents. They did not form underground Nazi resistance groups to fight the occupation. They became the most ardent supporters of a new, democratic West Germany. They wanted to build what they had seen in Texas and Ohio. They wanted the white bread, the cars, and the peace. The lie of the Third Reich had promised them the world and given them a graveyard. The truth of America had promised them nothing, yet given them a vision of what life could be. As they cleared the rubble with their bare hands, they weren't dreaming of a new Kaiser or a new Führer. They were dreaming of a refrigerator, a full pantry, and a life without war. History often measures the outcome of wars in lines drawn on maps, treaties signed in rail cars, or the grim arithmetic of casualties. We study the battles that broke the body of the Wehrmacht, Stalingrad, El Alamein, Normandy. But the experience of the German prisoners in America reveals a different kind of victory, one won not by high explosives, but by the sheer, undeniable force of reality. For 12 years, the Nazi regime had maintained power through a monopoly on truth. They constructed a world where Germany was the center of civilization, and its enemies were weak, corrupt, and crumbling. It was a narrative so potent that millions marched into the fire believing it was their destiny. But when those 370,000 men stepped onto the docks of New York and Boston, that narrative collided with the irrefutable truth of American power. The United States didn't just defeat these soldiers, it overwhelmed them. It crushed their ideology with the weight of its skyscrapers, the endlessness of its wheat fields, and the casual abundance of its daily life. The Golden Cage proved to be the most effective de-nazification program ever devised. It stripped away the myth of Aryan superiority simply by showing that a democracy could outproduce, outfight, and outeat a dictatorship. When these men returned to the ruins of Europe, they carried with them a memory that would help shape the modern world. They had seen the alternative to tyranny. They had tasted a life where prosperity was not a zero-sum game played at the expense of conquered neighbors. They rebuilt West Germany not just to restore what was lost, but to emulate what they had found across the Atlantic. In the end, the most devastating weapon the United States deployed against the spirit of the Third Reich wasn't the atomic bomb or the B-17. It was the view from a train window crossing the Midwest, a view of a free people living without fear under a skyline of lights that never went out. The lie could not survive the light, and for the men who saw it, the war was over long before the surrender was signed.